You're listening to Why We Do What We Do.
Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your ethereal host, Abraham.
And I am your not-so-Bible-thumping host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast. We talk all things psychology, and we really like to tackle the weird, the less popular, the sometimes unknown, and we are edutainment.
Yes.
We've decided. Yeah. So comedy, science, fun, weird trivia things that make you do well at trivia night, assuming they're psychology-themed questions.
For sure.
That's us.
That's what we try to do.
Absolutely. Now, if you'd like to support the show, if you like what you hear today, you can always head over to our Patreon account. You can subscribe, buy some merch from our store. I'll talk more about that at the end of this. But today, we are talking about something special, something unique, and that is why they're the godless ones.
This is, I think, an interesting and I would say complex topic to discuss. It's going to ruffle some feathers because, I mean, besides the fact that we just kind of tend to enjoy doing that, it is one of those ones that people tend to be very passionate about. And so we're hoping to kind of just have an actual discussion about this and kind of share how people end up in a space where they don't really believe in a higher power or some kind of spiritual being.
Yeah, this is going to contain some sensitive material for many people. We'll be discussing religion, but in a more sort of peripheral manner, I guess. In fact, we'll kind of really be talking about the absence of religion. So if discussions of religion bother you, fear not. This is an episode about those who don't believe. Even if that's maybe not your cup of tea, just know that that's what we're talking about today. And we're asking about why those don't believe, and we're nosy like that.
Yeah, it's really about kind of the idea of atheism.
Yeah.
So when we talk about this, I think it's important to provide context. Belief pervades everything. So Cher asks us if we believe in life after love.
Do you believe in life after love?
Boom, 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 boom. I can feel something. And I won't go that far. The Kid in the Polar Express believed too. Someone believed in a thing called love.
I believe in a thing called love.
That's our darkness reference for the day, of all things. Whitney and Mariah both told us that there can be miracles when we believe, in a wildly whitewashed animated movie about Moses as well.
Fact.
But that's besides the point. We're not talking about all of those things. We are talking about atheism today.
And also want to note that we're not intending this to be a proselytization. We're not trying to convince you to be atheists. Actually, where I really got interested in this topic was the fact that most people are not atheists. And it kind of made me wonder, I feel like people who are religious have got to wonder, these atheists, what do they believe? Like, what do they think happens when we die? Where is their sort of compass? You know, what path are they following if they're not following a path? And so that's kind of why I got interested in talking about this.
Now, according to our friends George and Charles Merriam, in collaboration with Noah Webster, and the company you didn't know they found until just now, atheism is defined as, quote, a lack of belief or a strong disbelief in the existence of a god or any gods, end quote. Now, cross this with agnostic, as the two somewhat but not related words begin with A and deal with counterstances that conflict with belief. We are going to talk about agnosticism as well a little bit. Now, agnostic is defined as holding, quote, the view that any ultimate reality, such as God, is unknown and probably unknowable, end quote. So we're going to try to do our best to unpack that or talk about that a little bit, because those two things, atheism and agnosticism, are close but not the same.
That by itself is a point of contention. I think most people would agree with you on that. And I have long argued that I think they are the same. Yeah. Because the agnostic definition here, the view that any ultimate reality is unknown, that's the atheist position. Like, yeah, the atheist position is a lack of belief in these things, which is essentially saying that it's unknown. Like, we don't know. Atheism is not a claim to know of the existence or non-existence of a deity. It is that it can't be known. And so that's why I feel like this comes up so much now that we recently talked about idioms, that this is a hair splitting exercise. Yeah.
So we're going to take a close look at that part, unknowable, but we're also going to consider that as we go through today, we're going to talk about what it means to know something as a tangible proof of its existence, right? So we're going to look at what does it mean? What proof needs to be there to be able to prove that something exists? Like, for example, I think we've talked about aliens. I do believe aliens exist based on statistical inference, not necessarily that I have seen the evidence. Because just by its very nature, by the expansive universe that we live in, it's likely that there is some life out there beyond us, I would imagine.
It's called the Drake equation, if y'all are familiar with that. Basically saying, like, given the necessary ingredients for life, the probability that life exists, like you can sort of, the equation is essentially meant to look at sort of galaxies and the stars and say, like, what is the probability there's more life? And the probability is really good,
Yeah. Exactly. So many have capitulated to the futility in attempting to ask such existential and immeasurable questions. Many have talked about that, like, you can ask a question, does God exist? We're never going to get an answer for that on this mortal plane that we exist in, as far as we know. I shouldn't say never, never say never, that kind of thing. But it's unlikely, and those existential questions, those immeasurable questions, become kind of a unique thing. Now, sometimes it's better not knowing. Maybe people might argue that too, but you don't need the extra headache worrying about whether mundane behavior will be accepted by others. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of how behavior is influenced by these types of religious or non-religious types of kind of contexts.
That I believe is supposed to be essentially the position of agnosticism, which again, I would argue that same thing, the futility in attempting to ask this immeasurable question, is also an atheist position. Like, atheists aren't out there saying, like, let's try and prove the non-existence of God. Yeah. Like, they're not, because that's not, there's no point in, you don't prove negatives. That's not something you can do in science.
Right.
Matter of fact, it's essentially a logically weak position to argue that you can't prove a negative and therefore it likely exists. And that's true of many things beyond the discussion of even talking about a God of any kind. So that, again, I think that what people are doing when they're asserting that agnosticism is something, and it's something different from atheism, is then sort of creating a straw man out of atheism and what that's supposed to mean. Mm-hmm. Until I hear otherwise, that is where I'm planting my flag.
I'll support that. I'll back you up on that.
Thanks. Okay, so we do need to give an overview here of just what we're talking about with atheism. And first we need to consider what will be our baseline understanding in discussing this topic. And one of the main things that's going to come up that you'll hear from atheists is evidence. And when we're thinking about science, when we're trying to understand the world around us, when we're talking about evidence, it's just not like, forensic evidence. We're just talking about, do we have something to indicate one set of beliefs over another, right? It is the source by which we make decisions in our sciences. It is the level of analysis by which we interpret the world around us. So whether in behavior analysis, a discipline we talk about often, or any other discipline, our jobs, our philosophy, that requires the existence of something that is tangible in some way. And even ideas often can work a little bit in this way, but mostly we're just like, we need to understand the world around us. Let's look at the world around us, right? That's what we use as proof for whatever theory or hypothesis one might have. To put that simply, this is a quote that gets used often that I always like, attributable to Carl Sagan. Quote, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence."
So I think it's important to discuss too within this space that when we talk about atheism, we are not talking about atheism and scientists being one and the same. There are plenty of atheists that are not very good scientists, and there are plenty of scientists that are not atheists. So I think it is important to kind of understand that what we are talking about is they are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they are two different topics that can overlap and intertwine, but they are a little bit different. So I just want to kind of point that out too, because I know plenty of behavior analysts who are spiritual and are also very great scientists. And I know plenty of atheists that also believe in a whole bunch of other things that are really bizarre. So I think it's important to kind of have that distinction within that.
It's not like an inoculation against believing dumb things too.
They
tend to have a lot of overlap with like critical thinking and atheism. Like those tend to overlap a lot. But they're not the same exactly. And there are scientists who are good scientists who are religious. There's actually some governmental science head that was retiring. I think it's an appointed position, and he was like a born again Christian, but he also was like a very thorough scientist who saw the merit and value of science. Mm-hmm. And he more or less just thought that life had to have been created by some kind of God being. I think, again, one does not preclude the other in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, to go back to the idea of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, atheists typically reject the existence of any sort of God and higher power given the absence of tangible evidence of such. So what you'll hear a lot of is atheists will say, well, there's not atheists in general, but the point would be there's not sufficient evidence to say that a God exists for me to believe that there is a God to believe in. And so you'll find a lot of atheists might also fall into the category of skepticism, questioning others on their own beliefs and being concerned about the nefarious actions that religion has led to some people to commit. So you'll see people have done some really poor things in the name of religion, but also have done poor things in the name of other things too. So Skinner, 1953, in Science and Human Behavior, describes atheism as a type of, quote, revolt against the theological system used in control, end quote. And that's from page 360 of that book. Now here he recognizes what countless notable atheists have indicated, that there exists a controlling pattern of governance in many organized religions that may seem a bit coercive when examined from the outside. When we kind of look in on some religious practices, they might be coercive in nature. And that's not necessarily religious practice. That might be organized religion applying a certain type of coercion on their people. Now, granted, many are indoctrinated from young ages into whatever religion it is, from their parents, peers, community, whatever. And the perpetual expectations and stigma associated with rebelling against such expectations are fundamental to understanding why faith persists in many environments, but why also you're going to find kind of people are stigmatized as a result of revolting.
Okay, so I do want to point out that just acknowledging the fact that most of our listeners probably have actually they're familiar with a lot of this. Like, you know what an atheist is, you know what an agnostic is, you know what systems of belief do and don't exist. And we're leading up to, part of the discussion today that I think is fun. What we wanted to have with this is to actually ask some people in our crew, the people who are that help with why we do what we do. We wanted to ask them their journey, and it felt necessary to just unpack a little bit more inside of that conversation. So for those who aren't already aware, which again is probably very few of our listeners, there are some things worth clarifying, which is one, that atheist.org clarifies that, quote, atheism is not a disbelief in gods or a denial of gods. It is a lack of belief in gods, end quote. And again, the point here is that it is not believing in a lack of God. It is just not having a belief in a God.
Right. And so simply a rejection of the existence of gods held by the majority, a simple rejection does not tell us by definition how an atheist falls towards other values, or specifically how they raise their kids, whether they're pro-choice or pro-life, big or small government, or what car they drive. It simply means that they don't have a belief. It doesn't mean a lack of morals. It doesn't mean a lack of ethical compasses. It simply means they don't have a belief towards a higher power.
Similarly, from the atheists.org, they say, quote, atheism is not a belief system, nor is it a religion, end quote. And that falls in line with what I was saying earlier. And there's this really great analogy, and we'll thank Alan for helping to put together the notes on this one. Did a really great job. But he found this analogy, quote, if atheism is a religion, then not collecting stamps is a hobby, end quote. And I really like that to highlight this point, especially.
When I read that, when we were going through notes, I was like, oh, that's really good.
Yeah,
I really like that.
Nailed it.
Now, atheism, while not a religion itself, is a stance protected by the same constitutional rights that a Jewish, Muslim, or Christian individual might have, or even a Scientologist and a witch. That's you, John Travolta and Stevie Nicks. You are protected as well.
Very good. And just sort of thinking about this, one of the more notable atheists of relatively recent history, Christopher Hitchens, who has since passed on. It's a funny way of saying it, passed on. I think he would just, right? I think he would prefer to say dead. Yeah. Yeah. I think that was very much how he would prefer that to be said. He died. He said that almost everyone is pretty close to an atheist. Everyone rejects all the gods that are out there except the one that they believe in, even for those who are theistic. Just that if there's hundreds and hundreds of gods, and so let's say if you're a Christian, then you reject all those gods but one. So you're an atheist, you're 99% atheist or something like that.
I like that.
Yeah, interesting way of sort of rephrasing that. So,
yeah.
With respect to terminology in here, atheists.org advise against alternative terms that avoid leaning into atheistic beliefs. So these subtly related terms include agnostic, humanist, secular, bright, and free thinker. That was a quote from there. And, I always really liked secular humanist as a phrase. I feel like it really kind of highlights the main point. And we'll get to this talking a little bit about morals and values and that sort of thing for an atheist. But secular humanists, I think, really captured my understanding of that position, which was essentially it is a humanist position. It is a kindness, compassion, equity, and generally supporting the well-being of humankind, and then doing so in the absence of any organized religion.
And I like that term too. I think for a long time I was very afraid to say I was an atheist because I was worried about guys. So I would use the term agnostic, but I realized that an atheist is a better fit term for me. But yeah, I do appreciate like the humanist approach, like that phrasing too, which is interesting because you'll find that there's overlap with humanist and Satanist approaches.
Yeah.
And maybe one day we'll do an episode on Satanism in general, because I think that will be really interesting.
Yeah.
I think it would be really fun because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around that. But
very much so.
But I think that goes back to this point specifically where the terms that are related or similar, but not quite capturing what this encompasses, I think it's really important to use terms as they should be. And so that's where atheist.org would say, use atheist if you're going to use this, because it is more comprehensive.
Right. There are other terms in here that are included in the advice against using, I think. So that includes cultural Catholic, in which one hails from a practicing devout Catholic sort of upbringing, but no longer participates in the traditional behavior of Catholicism beyond just demonstrating what they would consider to be their core values, which might be generosity, honesty, exploiting Christmas, that sort of thing.
Just the standard fare.
Right.
It's funny that comes up. I think that's my dad at this point in time. Like, he was raised and doesn't really do any of the Catholic stuff, but definitely loves Christmas.
Gotcha.
So now the group also asserts, the group being atheist.org, the group also asserts that despite what people report in surveys, 5% call themselves atheists outright, but 11% say they do not believe in gods, which makes them more or less atheists. You'll find that kind of these stats are a little bit interesting. People are afraid to report, but if it walks like a duck on water, it might be an atheist. So interesting stuff, though. It's interesting that only 5% of people are comfortable enough to say that they're an atheist.
Yeah, and I've heard that number before. I thought that had maybe grown a little bit over time. But social stigma associated with publicly identifying as an atheist may have a significant impact on atheism not really being widely recognized and represented in the culture at large at the moment. And so why might this be the case? Well, I think it's fairly straightforward. We can probably speculate pretty easily. There's family pressure, social norms. I think a lot of things to probably unpack in a whole nother episode in terms of, I think there's just certain pressure to have certain belief systems or not.
Yeah.
And that those are one of the reasons that stigma kind of persists. And you're right. Like, I think a lot of people are afraid to just outright say that they're atheists, and probably for a lot of reasons. And, how many more generations do we expect it to last before people are more open about a lack of organized religion in their lives? And I think if we look at the past, we have come a long way. I think if we went back to the 70s, you would be hard pressed to find very many people who were willing to say that, or even who believed it, and I think that over time, what we have seen is that at the very least, people are more willing to share that about themselves. We have a lot of people who are very outspoken atheists now, right? That they have talk shows, right? I think Bill Maher comes up. Not someone to necessarily celebrate about this, but someone who's outspoken about it. Penn and Teller, I think, are outspoken atheists. Mm-hmm. Richard Dawkins, obviously an outspoken atheist. So there's plenty that are sort of well-known people, and they're kind of well-known for their atheism.
It's interesting, too, because this does bring up the conversation about the cultures and learning histories of people, right? So, growing up in the United States, it is perceived that the country, like, one thing I love about the United States is people think that we have an official language and official religion, and we don't. And like, for those folks that live outside of the United States, like, people would assume that, Americans speak English. Well, we don't have English is not our official language. We do not have an official language.
I didn't know that.
For the same reason, we do not have an official religion, even though we are primarily considered a Christian nation. And so it's really fascinating that in a space where freedom of religion has always been touted, and freedom of religion just simply means that we can practice how we want to practice. That doesn't mean that we're free of social stigmas. It is really interesting to find that atheism is one that is often stigmatized and then immediately tied to, I don't even want to say Satanist practices, but like unsavory practices that come up, because during the satanic panic in the 80s, the late 70s, early 80s and all that, and through the 90s, it was always the Satanists or the atheists that were the problem in the Christians who were upholding the moral fabric of society. So it's just like as a general discussion of the context in which atheism is stigmatized, it is fascinating to think that like in a country where freedom of religion is practiced, atheism is one that doesn't come up as often as you would think.
Yeah, I wonder how the broader Christian community outside of the United States views the kind of fundamental extremism that has arisen in the United States. I wonder if we could call the national religion of the United States Americanism, because I feel like that captures it fairly well. Mm-hmm. Just sort of
cheeseburgers.
Yeah, cheese. Sure. I was going to say nationalistic xenophobia, but yeah, jingoism maybe is our religion. Anyway, I just realized we really need to pray on this and let the capitalism do its work in the background. All right. I hope you had an opportunity to pray to the gods of money while we were on our little break there. So how does one sort of become an atheist? What's your sort of journey to becoming an atheist?
So I got here, I would say it was not a long journey.
Long walk off a short pier.
Yeah. I think I was primed for it pretty early. It all starts when I was 4. My aunt used to take me to a local church, and it was a Southern Baptist church. And if anybody is familiar with Southern Baptism, it can be pretty extreme. Yeah. And so the church that I went to, or that we would go to, was an extreme Southern Baptist church. And again, that's one church. I'm not saying that's everybody, but it was kind of a mega church in my town.
Oh.
And it was one of those places. It was actually the church, if you all are familiar, anybody who's listening, there was a period of time where there was this one Southern Baptist church that was going around in a tour bus, and they wanted to recruit 1 million Southern Baptists in their pursuit of godliness. I don't know if y'all remember that. If you do, write in and let us know.
Recruit them onto the bus? Because that's a lot of people.
I don't know if they were going to fit 1 million on the bus.
Okay.
They maybe could have. I don't know.
It was like clown car.
Yeah, it was real. It was a real wild bus. It was God powered.
Oh, well, sure.
Yeah, divinity and all that. So that was the church that I went to when I was a kid. And I never really, I used to get in trouble in Sunday school because I always thought the lessons were boring and I never paid attention. And they had brought up concerns because we were supposed to draw a picture of ourselves, or we outlined ourselves, and then we were supposed to draw a picture of Jesus in this picture. And I colored my Jesus green, and they were upset that Jesus was green. And I was like, I don't know, Jesus could be green. You haven't seen him.
Certainly not white.
Yeah, certainly not white. That's a lot of where those conversations started, where I kind of would ask the questions of like, well, what about this? Or this doesn't make sense. Or is there oxygen in a whale's stomach? That doesn't make any sense either. You can't start a fire in there. That's a real problem. And so I kind of would ask those questions about that. And my parents weren't really devout. And then when I was about 16, I would say that I had been leaning agnostic for a while and kind of already in that space where I'm like, I don't really know. I'm not going to pretend to know. And then in the span of like 6 months, like 6 or 7 people that were really close to me had died.
Wow.
And it was really intense. And it was one of those situations where I started questioning, like, what kind of loving God would allow, a dad of 3 to suddenly die and widow his entire family and leave them? What kind of God would like take a 16-year-old and give them leukemia and then make them suffer for years and years and years? And it was stuff like that I finally went like, forget this. This is absurd. There's just no way. It doesn't make any sense that like the stories that are being told have led to this, or that the stories that are being told about this loving God would allow for something this horrible to happen. So, and I know that's kind of a story that comes up a lot, but that's my story. That's how I got there. And from 16 on, there's never been a question for me.
I feel like my journey, my reasoning was not good. Like I was right for the wrong reasons, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was raised in a non-religious household. Did not go to church. Wasn't really discussed. The extent to which it was discussed was that my grandma was religious and my dad, her son, was very strongly atheist, and they would argue with each other through me, where they basically would communicate a message to me and I'd communicate it to one party, and then they'd be like, no, and then they'd communicate to me and I'd communicate it back. And I didn't really know anything at the time, obviously.
Yeah.
But I did try, like I tried to make my family go to church several times, because over the summers we would go to this Christian camp, and I found that very compelling. And so I'd say, well, we need to go to church. We need to do this thing. And I found the whole church experience to be very confusing and unwelcoming and just like weird.
Yeah.
It didn't feel comfortable at all. And so went like a handful of times and stopped. But I think I didn't feel strongly about it until I discovered the Mormon religion. And when I heard what they believed, I was like, oh yeah, there's no God. That's pretty clear to me now.
Yeah.
And as I said, it wasn't like logical. It wasn't right that would be like, that's not a logical way to proceed from like, okay, this doesn't make sense to me to, okay, there's no God. But I think from there, I was able to find a clearer sort of philosophical orientation to it. But yeah, that was sort of how I went. And that was actually a similar age, I think, 16, maybe.
I think that's the age where you start kind of formulating that stuff. I mean, my daughter figured it out pretty early, and it was a lot of questions. It was like your story, like her grandmother on my ex-wife's side is really religious. And so they would have discussions and they would do Bible studies, and my daughter would go to church. I'm like, I'm not going to fight this right now. I'm going to provide, like, if you're going to do this, I'm going to also provide my view. It's totally backfired on me because I would always teach her to kind of question the answer of everything. I'm like, but everything but what I say. Like, I've kind of had that conversation with her, like, stop it. She's like very much so. She's very argumentative. She's like, but like in a good way. She's very persuasive and all that.
Yeah.
And she asks really good, insightful questions. And it's like, it's going to serve her well later, but it's a pain if you're a parent.
Yeah.
So it is one of those things where it's like, when you start kind of asking questions, it does kind of punch a hole into this stuff. But I did have a really great conversation with a friend of mine who grew up in punk rock and has stayed in punk rock and is a pastor and all that. And the argument that he made was, if you take the Bible as like, if you take parts of the Bible and consider them as true, it can't be that parts are true and all are not true. It has to be all or nothing that's true. And he's like, and if that's the case, then if you're saying this is in the Bible and this is true, then you're admitting that these other parts are true, and it undoes your atheism argument. He's like, if you take the Bible as a set of stories and parables, then you are relieved of the burden of trying to prove the existence or disprove the existence of God in that too. So like, it was a really insightful, really cool conversation about that. So not that he's converted me, but I did have that. I did think that was kind of a necessary point to make in here.
That's fair. It sounds like the argument he was making is the Bible is definitely not true. But I choose to believe it anyway.
Well, he said it's not supposed to be true. That's not where faith is supposed to come from.
Okay.
These stories are not supposed to be taken as like historical events.
Yeah. I always like to say I could be persuaded with sufficient evidence to change my mind on anything.
Sure.
Good luck. Starting from the place of not only zero, but possibly deeply in the negative with respect to evidence. You got quite a journey to convince me that I'm wrong. But like, I'm open to anywhere that science and data takes me. And if that ends up being that there is some deity thing, then like, so be it. But it's got to be convincing evidence. And I got to say, I really don't think it's out there. I really think that we figured out a long time ago that it's not out there. So yeah, I could be wrong. I'm open to it.
And that's my perspective too. My thing as an atheist, I think this is something that comes up a lot with atheists too, is like a lot of times it will sound like atheists are harsh towards belief systems. And I certainly am not I'm harsh towards harmful practices. I will be outspoken against harmful practices. But if you believe, then believe. If that works for you, then do that. That's great. It's just not for me. And that's kind of my thing. It's like, I'm not there. I will never forget one of my best friends growing up. He became a pastor at a church locally. I remember we played baseball together. We grew up together. We grew up in the same kind of like socioeconomic status. And he's like, hey man, I want to come over and talk to you one day. And he came over and he tried to convince me to go to his church. And I thought that was like his reasoning was noble. He's like, when I pass and when I move on and I go to heaven, I want to have the people that I love and care about with me. And I was like, first of all, are you saying that I'm not a good person to make it to heaven? Like, I kind of had that conversation with him. I was just joking with him, but I was like, I appreciate the sentiment and like where he was going with it. But I just said, it's like, it's just not for me right now. This is not where I'm at. This is not where I need to be. This is not where I feel I'm not compelled to drive in that direction. And I still feel like I can do good things without having this element in my life or this variable in my life. And so that was kind of the conversation. It was very respectful. It was very honest. And we're still friends to this day. And we have really interesting conversations, but I think it's very interesting that he went into the army and I didn't.
That is interesting.
I was like, wait a second. Yeah. Wouldn't you think that it should go the other way, given that I have the lack of morals? But yeah. So.
Wow, that was a can of worms that could explode.
Yeah, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. It was a singular circumstance, not a commentary on anything else.
Okay. Well, so what we were talking about is how one arrives at atheism. And I think, it's similar to how we'll adopt really any major and complex behavior patterns. Things like beliefs fall into that for sure. And it's always a combination of our overall experiences, circumstances, our overall actions, rules, things that we observe from those around us. obviously our immediate family plays a huge role in what we observe in terms of practicing characteristics of a particular religion. If that's the case, you're far more likely to also follow in that path. Conversely, if the family does not, then you're less likely to. As I was kind of like, I was a little rebellious against my family, but ultimately ended up in about the same place that I started.
Yeah.
And so it makes a lot of sense that that's how that would more or less turn out.
So a study was conducted by Brunel University in London, and it was done based on U.S. residents, and it found that simply a lack of exposure to credibility-enhancing displays of religious faith found among a lot of U.S. residents. Now, one particularly interesting comment by the researchers was that some atheists like to say their views stem from, quote, rational, effortful thought, end quote. But we know that humans don't do that. But the study also demonstrates that the intensity of religious practice in the home is a major indicator. So granted, the study excludes patterns that may be observed in any other country and certainly did not demonstrate control over regional differences across the U.S., but it is an important kind of point, and that goes back to what you were saying. And also, you know, my circumstance too. I grew up with the Southern Baptist piece on my mom's side. My mom didn't go, but my aunt did. And then my dad grew up Catholic, and so we celebrated Good Friday, and that was about it.
Interesting. Yeah, not a lot of celebration of many of them. I actually had never heard of like Ash Wednesday until I was in college. Mm-hmm. And then one time I happened to notice that everyone around me had black smudges on their forehead. And I was like, what on earth happened this morning?
Yeah. You know, it's funny, as I mentioned something about that because I saw that in the airport the other day, and my pastor friend was like, there's nothing more metal than looking a priest in the face and acknowledging your own mortality in the face of God. Like, he's like, that is as metal as you could get. And I was like, that's fair. That's actually a pretty good argument. The Bible is pretty metal when you get into it.
Certainly, certain parts of it for sure. All right, we have someone with a hard to pronounce name, so I'm going to go look that up, and we'll be right back after this break. Okay, so we're going to talk about a figure, a relatively well-known figure. His name is Peter Boghossian. I want to make clear, many of our listeners will have heard of this character. We're not talking about a lot of his political statements or statements on, I think, general cultural relativity sort of things, social justice. We're just going to talk about his work. Like, we're not endorsing all of his opinions at all. We're not even necessarily endorsing his opinion about atheism, but he has a lot to say about it. And so that's why we're going to just reference his work. So make sure that's clear.
Yeah, he's known for studying atheism. Right. And so like that's like what his academic career has been, is studying atheism. So that's why his name is coming up in reference to atheism.
Yeah. I would love to talk, with Phil Zuckerman or talk about some of the work of Christopher Hitchens. And there's many others, but he's written recently about this. So he's a philosophy professor and author, published a book in 2013 titled, quote, A Manual for Creating Atheists, end quote. And he encouraged readers to act as what he called a street epistemologist, with the intention of, as he sort of describes, helping others get past their faith to create a better world. So again, this is, just want to make sure we're clear. We're not commenting on any way sort of his intentions here or anything, just about the things he's saying. And his rationale for this is that in place of faith, one might find a, quote, world that uses intelligence, reason, rationality, thoughtfulness, ingenuity, sincerity, science, and kindness to build a future, end quote. And more importantly, Boghossian details the alternative, quote, a world built on faith, delusion, pretending, religion, fear, pseudoscience, superstition, or a certainty achieved by keeping people in a stupor that makes them pawns of unseen forces because they're terrified, end quote. And so that's sort of the position he's coming from in talking about religion and atheism.
The quotes that we've shared here are, I would say, commonplace, as like very outspoken atheists that are also not super, I don't want to say respectful, that's not the word, but they're like, it's interesting that he says, like, in one sentence, say, like, using kindness to build a future, and then in the next one calling any sort of religion a delusion. Like, I feel like that's kind of an odd thing to say. And I mean, that everybody's got their own opinions on it, but that's an interesting thing where I'm like, it doesn't seem very kind to people's faith, Yeah. And as somebody who is a very dug in deep atheist, like, I'm very in there. Like, I'm like, I get what he's saying. I'm here for it.
Yeah.
But now what we seem to get here in these quotes are two options. one of seemingly blind faith to an unknown, and another that categorically rejects the idea, but even further sees it as a potential for danger, right? So like you've got these kind of like two situations. People believe to an unknown faith, but also reject the idea and produce the situation that is dangerous for other people. Now, there doesn't seem to be much middle ground in Boghossian's argument, and he admits so later in his book when he counters the argument that atheism is simply another faith itself. So he kind of has these kind of complex discussions around this particular phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think he's saying that atheism is not a type of faith, and we'll also talk about that a bit later.
Right.
And, Boghossian notes some of the atrocities that religious individuals have committed in history, including violence against women, heretics, or what they might have been dubbed as heretics, homosexuals, blasphemy, denying rights such as education, safety, and other freedoms for individuals to basically make decisions about their own lives. And that's certainly something that I think is known, like well known. I think it's not even controversial to show how much damage religion has done in persecuting other people at various times in history and various people of other faiths. I think religion has often when one religion gained prominence in a particular ruling group, then often what happened is that they would subjugate other religions. I think if we look at Israel and Palestine, if we look at, I'm just going to say what has happened between most religions and Jews, the Jewish community in many places in time and history. There's lots and lots of examples of one religious group coming to power and essentially then subjugating another. I think Christians have at various points been the subjugated group and also the persecuting group.
Yep.
And so it's an unquestioned history what has happened there. And I think the argument that's being made on Boghossian's part here is that happened because of those religions, and that had there been an absence of religion, they wouldn't have had those things to argue against. Now, it's not to get too far into this, but it's very possible they would have found something else that was like a hate driving wedge between them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So an example of the Rwandan genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsis. I'm saying that right, correct?
I think so.
Okay. So anyway, groups will find reasons to subjugate one another with or without religion, but religion has definitely, at least historically, been the major driving force. But, it's sort of like there was an argument that someone was making that, women can't be the leaders of countries because they're emotional. They're more likely to go to war. And the response they got was, haven't all wars been started by men? And,
yeah.
And I think that's kind of the same argument here is like, without religion, people would just, subjugate one another. They would kill one another and commit genocide based on other things like race. And say like, haven't most of the genocides and those things been with religion that have been in place? And the answer is yes.
I think within that discussion, it's definitely more nuanced because I think that there is, you've got like people in power, you've got marginalized groups versus the majority, you've got all these different situations, and it might be that there's a resource grab that is under the mask of religion and stuff like that. So I tend to be pretty skeptical in that conversation in general, because it always comes down to, like the logical thing would be, okay, I'm going to subjugate a group because there's resources in this area that are going to be beneficial to my group, right? Like I'm going to control this group because of X, Y, and Z. But there are examples where it's just straight up an issue of religion. So it is a fascinating discussion. It is one that I think I don't know that we could unpack that on a single episode.
Yeah.
Or really unpack that on a single podcast. I think that the discussion around that is so incredibly nuanced. And again, I think this particular episode, it's about atheism specifically.
Yeah.
I was wondering if we were going to veer off onto these like side roads too. So you knew it was going to happen. I know we would do that anyway. But yeah, I think it is a complex discussion.
Yeah.
I don't know that Peter Boghossian is the end all be all authority on it, but it is some interesting stuff to kind of postulate and kind of like go through and be like, well, I wonder if religion didn't exist, what that would look like. And it's probably that human beings are just generally violent creatures.
Well, I think, and Phil Zuckerman, actually, he kind of does some interesting stats where it looks at various levels of that kind of violence across countries and the various levels of religion. And he essentially showed that the more religious a country was, the more violent and less humanitarian it tended to be.
Yeah.
But he also said that's not to say there's a cause-effect relationship, but at least to say that the presence of religion does not prevent that violence from happening.
Right.
And I think that those data are very clear. But there's so many side roads to go down on this beyond what we originally intended. We have so much to cover. I mean, we've got still to talk about how people turn to religious beliefs. We've got to talk about what atheists believe happens to us after we die. We've got a God-shaped hole in our hearts and our lives. So there's so many topics to cover, and we've already gone nearly the length of an entire episode. And what that means to me, I think, is that, as can happen sometimes with Alan's very thorough notes, I think we're going to need a second discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're definitely going to have a further discussion on this. So thanks, Alan, for giving us more episodes than we planned for.
In the meantime, I think we do have some things to recommend. Do you have something to recommend?
I certainly do.
Perfect.
Recommendations.
My recommendation this week is a movie that I finally got to sit down and watch, and it was called Free Guy. So if you're not familiar with Free Guy, basically what it is, it's a recent Ryan Reynolds property where he is a NPC, so non-playable character. Is that what that stands for?
Right.
Okay. So and he's in this kind of open world game that is full of what he calls heroes, and they're people with glasses. And so like the people with glasses are heroes, and he ends up getting his hands on a pair of glasses and becomes kind of this like own AI in this system and starts kind of learning that the world is much bigger than him. And it's done really well. It's a really interesting commentary about destiny and choices and all that stuff. And it's actually very funny too. It's a very silly kind of take on that idea. And Ryan Reynolds is great in it. Subtle, not super over the top. Taika Waititi is in it and does a really great job as one of the villains.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun overall. So I recommend it just it's a PG-13 movie, so it's not super violent. It's about 2 hours long, which is kind of interesting that it was a longer movie.
Right.
There's like a lot of funny gags in it where you're like, oh, that's good.
Yeah.
When he asked for a cappuccino in the coffee shop and everybo's like, they panic because they're like, we don't do cappuccinos.
I like it. That scene. The cop unholsters his gun.
yeah. And in the background, like there's a lot of like background visual gags too that are really good. So he's standing at the counter and a tank pulls up and like the turret turns and points into the coffee shop at him while he's ordering. And then he goes, no, I'm just kidding. I'll just have a black coffee, 2 sugars, medium, whatever.
Yeah.
And then the tank pulls away and everybody relaxes. And it's like a funny little gag, but it is a really great, fun movie. Channing Tatum is in it. And his character's name, his username, is one of my favorite things ever. It's Revengeman Button. So it's like silly things like that make me laugh. So anyway, go watch Free Guy. It is a lot of fun to watch, especially if you like video games and stuff.
Yeah. And then like Channing Tatum's character is the avatar for this guy who definitely does not look like Channing Tatum.
Yeah.
To say the least.
At all.
Yeah, really funny.
Vacuuming.
Yeah, I would 100% second that recommendation. It was such a fun movie. Really enjoyed it. I know it's available, at least at the time of this recording, on Disney Plus and HBO Max. Mm-hmm. So you should be able to find it streaming in a couple of places. And honestly, it is so worth the rental or even probably just purchasing it because I'm definitely watching this movie again.
Yeah. It is. It's just fun. Low expectations. It's not a crazy thinker movie.
Yeah.
So just enjoy it.
Yeah. And then look for the fun Easter eggs in the background that are great.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm recommending this talk show that is called Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. And I think this is a spinoff of Jon Stewart or The Daily Show or something like that. But yeah, Samantha Bee she did like Correspondence and was on those shows for a really long time. And she's sort of getting her own moment in the spotlight. And she is very funny. She's very good. She does these really fun topics and takes on things kind of similar to what we've been seeing. There's Amber Ruffin is another one who's sort of like this. They're all kind of like John Oliver in a way. They get to pick a topic and do a really thorough sort of investigation into a short snippet of that topic and give a lot of like great video evidence of the point that they're making and make a ton of jokes along the way. So she's very funny, very well informed. I really enjoy watching her. I've only seen her on YouTube. I think she maybe has like an airtime on a channel that comes up, but I've only ever watched her on YouTube. So I'm sure that I'm missing something, but that's where I would recommend it.
Yeah, no, she's great. She's hilarious.
Yeah, super fun. So anyway, Free Guy, Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. Anything else there?
Nope, that's it. That's all I got today.
All right. Well, then we need to say thank you for the people who helped make this happen. Alan for his awesome notes today. Thank you for recording with me today, Shane. Thank you, everybody who is listening for putting up with us. Thanks to the rest of the team. We've got Justin, Selena, and Kyle and Britt for all of their work on the show. And then, of course, we could only make this happen with our wonderful Patreon supporters, which includes Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Costia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and just for good measure, I'm going to say Josh one more time. And I do not at all mean to sound like I am being snarky. I'm like legitimately like really appreciative of awesome people.
Yes.
If you'd like to support us, you can join our Patreon for as little as $1 a month. That'll get you a shout out. But if you join at a higher tier, there are other benefits, including videos, uncut episodes, ad-free episodes, notes, all kinds of stuff like that. That's really totally worth your time and money, and helps out the show. You can always rate and review our show wherever you listen to podcasts. That does help us out. Telling a friend, just say, hey, listen to this awesome podcast. It'll change your life forever, and you will thank me later. And that also is a great thing that you can do. Subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes and all of that jazz. And another way that you can support us and walk away with something in your hand is you can go to our merch store. We've got mugs that are currently on sale. And that sale is ending after the second part of this series airs. So we'll have Atheism Part 1, Atheism Part 2, then end of sale. And that's on our mugs specifically. We've got 2 different coffee mug designs. We've got a shirt, sweaters, a couple different designs of beanies, a water bottle, which amazingly, so I thought this was just going to be this cheap little water bottle, right? I was like, I ordered it for myself, and it looks like it was just like sort of a generic water bottle, nothing too special. I swear it has kept ice cold for like 3 days.
I love that.
I've been like, yeah, I like ice in my water. I put it in there, and I was like, days later, there was still some ice in there. I was like, what is happening? Is this like magical material? So I don't know how they did that, but they did a really good job with the water bottle. And then, of course, we've got stickers. We've got a new logo that we've got on a couple of different merch items. On one of our hoodies has it, a beanie has it. So all kinds of stuff you can get from our store, and it helps us out too.
I love it. Every little bit goes right back into the podcast to do other cool things for y'all. So I think that it's really important for everybody to remember that. It's like we really try to put everything back into the show to make it a better show for you.
Absolutely. Now, if you would like to tell us about your faith or atheism or your journey to atheism or what you think happens to us after we die, we would love to hear from you. You should definitely reach out to us. You can find us on the social media platforms that exist, minus some newer ones that skew alt-right, not on those ones, and may not be on Twitter that much longer, given that one is also veering drastically alt-right.
Yeah.
But we'll be on, Facebook and Instagram and sort of the old haunts that you might look to find someone and talk to them.
Yeah.
And just that's at WWD podcast. You can also go to our website. You can drop us an email at info@wwdpodcast.com. We just like hearing from everybody. And hey, if you'd like to send us a letter, you can do that too. Reach out to us and I'll give you our P.O. box. You can send a letter there.
Yay.
You can also tell us about a TV show or a movie that you're interested in, and you can talk to us about other prominent atheists that you may have strong opinions about if you'd like to do that. I think, is there anything else I'm missing, Shane?
I think that covers it for this one.
Perfect. All right. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.podcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.